Welcome to this presentation on the life and career of architect Julian Abel, who for decades was the chief designer for Horace Trumbauer. This event is hosted by the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, whose mission is to advance the appreciation and practice of classical architecture and the classical tradition and all of its allied arts through bringing together educators, students, enthusiasts, and the population at large. I'm Barbara Eberlein, a member of the board of ICAA, and I'm joined today by our two speakers, Amy Cohen and David Brownlee, whose presentations will illuminate the many topics that will form the foundation for our later panel discussion. First, some introductions. Amy Cohen spent 20 years as a middle and high school social studies teacher, specializing in world geography and African American history. She serves as Director of Education for History Making Productions, a renowned film company that makes documentaries about the history of Philadelphia. She is also a speaker and writer on historical topics and is a monthly columnist for Hidden City, an online magazine about Philadelphia architectural landscapes. Amy serves on the board of the Ebenezer Maxwell Mansion, a house museum whose mission it is to showcase Victorian-era Philadelphia through architecture, furniture, gardens, and other collections. David Brownlee is an architectural historian at the University of Pennsylvania, whose publications on American and European topics and whose teaching have won many awards. The Society of Architectural Historians named him a fellow in 2015 and established the David B. Brownlee Dissertation Award in his honor in 2020. He has written about many Philadelphia architects and buildings, including Louis Kahn, Denise Scott Brown, Robert Venturi, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Barnes Foundation, the Benjamin Franklin Parkway, amongst many. David has long been active in civic affairs and now serves on the boards of the Preservation Alliance, the Athenaeum, the Design Advocacy Group, the Beth Shalom Preservation Foundation, and the Philadelphia World Heritage City Project. So let's turn up the wattage and explore a bit and see what we can learn about a man who, when asked whether or not a major architectural commission was all his design exclusively, is said to have responded, "The lines are Mr. Trumbauer's, but the shadows are all mine." This is a seemingly simple statement, and yet so telling about the decades of creative individuals who literally worked in the shadows. So David, it's your turn to do the illumination.
I'm delighted to be able to contribute to this discussion of Julian Abel, who was the first African American to graduate in architecture from the University of Pennsylvania. Despite racism, and despite the fact that he worked in the anonymity of a large firm, and despite the fact that that firm was not part of the modernist avant-garde, if a group of us, people like us, architects and architecture buffs who follow architectural activity in Philadelphia, had met 100 years ago, we would have known Julian Abel. It's time for us to catch up. Abel made waves as he passed through Penn. As a sophomore, he was already seated in the front row of the Architectural Society, and he was the president of the society in his senior year, 1902. In his day, architecture students worked in the drafting room on the third floor of College Hall. And there, Abel, who already had an architectural design certificate from what is now the University of the Arts, immediately demonstrated that he knew how to make impeccable shadowcast renderings, evocative portrayals of old buildings, and vibrant life drawings. And he won many prizes in the relentless succession of student competitions that defined architectural education in those days. An aristocratic house here on the left, a specialized botanical museum on the left here, a post office on the right, culminating in a huge cathedral in his senior year. As a junior, Abel won 2 competitions to create real things: a tablet for recording alumni gifts to the library at Penn, and a memorial gateway on the Haverford College campus honoring a tragically short-lived student athlete. Abel graduated with more awards than any classmate, including the Arthur Spade Brooke Memorial Prize, which Louis Kahn would win 22 years later. Penn's yearbook, of which he was an editor, and in which he was listed first because of the spelling of his name, called him willing and able. After graduation, he enrolled in a further design course at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, probably while continuing to work in an architect's office, as he had done while he was a student at Penn. However, starting in the spring of 1903, and for the next 3 years, Philadelphia's T-Square Club gave Bonners Ferry, Idaho, as his address. He had moved there to be with his beloved elder sister Bess, whose husband, John Cook, was the postmaster and pharmacist in that tiny town, and he helped to extricate her from an unhappy marriage and move her to Spokane, Washington, 90 miles away. There, he designed a house for her, which still stands, although its stucco was recently covered in siding. The outside should remind you of Voisey or Macintosh, and thanks to Zillow, I can show you the welcoming arts and crafts interior. In 1906, Abel brought Bess and her children back to Philadelphia, and she lived with him for the rest of her life. Until scholars made the Idaho-Washington connection, it was speculated that after Penn, Abel had gone off to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. This was logical, given his great respect for French architecture. And it is true that he wanted to go abroad. And in 1908, he applied for a passport, the application is on the left, in anticipation of a trip with his best friend at Penn and ever after, Louis Magaziner. We'll be hearing more about Louis Magaziner in a moment. They even got a letter of introduction from the provost. But that trip had to be postponed. Only in the spring of 1914 did Abel finally get to Europe and on his own, when he made these sketches of a Gothic house in France on the left and Palladio's great basilica at Vicenza on the center, and his sketch of it is on the right. It appears that he also made these delicious watercolors of buildings in Italy, France, Germany, and Spain on that trip. Some of these are in family collections today, but 4 of them were given to Penn. It is likely that Abel postponed his trip because he was busy. He had gone to work in Horace Trumbauer's office upon his return to Philadelphia, joining the very large staff that Trumbauer had assembled and organized to satisfy the wishes of his very large and prosperous clientele. Abel began as the assistant of Frank Seeberger, Trumbauer's chief designer, and he assumed Seeberger's leadership position when Seeberger left the firm in 1909. Notably, Trumbauer was not present in that group photograph, but he excelled in recruiting talent and promoting their teamwork, and also orchestrating the many outside collaborators who designed and made the interior woodwork and laid out the landscapes of his grandest houses. The office was already hugely prosperous when Abel joined it. Right out of the blocks in the 1890s, Trumbauer caught the eye of sugar merchant William Welsh Harrison, for whom he built a castle at the lower left, and the streetcar monopoly partners Peter Widener and William Elkins, for whom he designed a trio of gigantic houses in Elkins Park, 1 English Palladian, 1 Italian Renaissance, and 1 Tudor. Yes, indeed, you could have anything you want in Horace's restaurant. This was the enterprise that Abel would coordinate. He didn't draw every drawing, and he certainly didn't design every building, but he did design a lot, and he orchestrated a great deal more, and he took over the running of the firm after the boss's death in 1938. Both Abel and Trumbauer were shy and retiring in demeanor, and while the black man with a college degree and the white man who had apprenticed in an architect's office after 8th grade were not close friends, they were said to have treated each other with unfailing respect and courtesy. In 1919, they both bought houses, these houses, for themselves. We know that each visited the other at home. Abel's house on the left is in Doctors Row on Christian Street, home to many of the city's black professionals in the 1920s. And Trumbauer's is in Winfield, a pleasant enough place, but not the famous Main Line. That's Abel and the French musician Marguerite Boule, whom he married in his backyard in 1925. What can we say specifically about the work that Abel did in Trumbauer's office? I'll give you a couple of glimpses from my own research. First, the Free Library. On April 10th, 1911, 3 generations of the intermarried Elkins and Widener families met with the library head and convinced him, and then the mayor, that Trumbauer, the family's favorite architect, should be appointed to design the new library building that they aimed to subsidize. The job was assigned to Abel, which we know because it was he who presented this design to the clients on October 5th, 1911, and it was he who presented this design to the city's art jury, on which some of the city's leading artists and architects served, on April 2nd, 1912. This project was interrupted, however. Just 8 days later, the Titanic sailed from England. On board were George Widener and his son Harry Elkins. They had been scouting chef talent for their new Ritz-Carlton hotel, designed by Trumbauer, and they didn't make it home. Instantly, the family's library building propensity shifted to Harvard, Harry Elkins' alma mater, where they hired Trumbauer. At left, flanked by the widow and a surviving son, they hired Trumbauer to design a memorial library. As demonstrated by his direct correspondence with Harvard chief librarian William Coolidge Lane, Abel was the designer of that rapidly built neoclassical monument. Back in Philadelphia, the city had been slow to come up with its part of the funding, and Abel got to revise his design several times, matching ever more closely the buildings on the Place de la Concorde in Paris that it emulated. He took this revision to the art jury in 1916, and when the construction system was shifted to steel in 1919, and the building was shrunk in 1920, both to save costs, he engineered that as well. Abel's role in the design of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which also began in 1911, was more complicated. Thanks to the support of his old clients and friends who were members of the Fairmount Park Commission, Trumbauer was again named the architect, but this time in a strange partnership with the firm of Clarence Zantzinger. The two designers were contemptuous of each other, and in fact it was said they even refused to speak to each other. The two firms prepared 2 distinct designs in 1911 and 1912, but it was the Trumbauer design, I think it was the work of Abel, that was published. However, the art jury only tabled it for further discussion at that time. There was no money to build anyway, and so the two firms continued to work separately, assigning the work to 2 1913 Penn graduates who had recently come to work for them. Howell Lewis Shea, working for Trumbauer, produced the design on the left, and William Pope Barney with Zantzinger, the one that you see on the right. There's no time to discuss them today, but suffice to say, the Fairmount Park Commission wanted only one design, and when money finally became available to get started in 1915, they demanded just one. Good documentation shows that it was Shea in Trumbauer's office who worked out the compromise that was put on display with this model in the courtyard of City Hall at Christmas time in 1915. Shea and Barney soon went off to do other things, leaving the finalization of the design and its presentation to other people. Zantzinger's partner, Charles Borey, became the public spokesman for the project. Construction documentation was prepared in Trumbauer's office, and there Abel created these splendid presentation drawings in 1919. It's perhaps needless to say that no public mention was made of these men, and we can assume that similarly complicated and hidden stories lie behind all the vast productivity of Julian Abel in the Trumbauer office. The most famous part of that productivity is probably the long list of country houses for the plutocracy, building on the client base that had been established in the 1890s. Many of these houses, like Whitemarsh Hall and Miramar on the left, are rather cool renditions of French and British 18th century classicism. But in the suburbs of Philadelphia, The office sometimes adopted the warmer colors and gentler forms of the English Baroque, epitomized by Ardrossan on the right, the off-camera star of the movie The Philadelphia Story. But the Trumbauer office wasn't just about houses. They populated Philadelphia's skyline with Gothic and several types of classical office buildings, like the Widener Building at the center here, and medieval and classical hotels, including the Widener family's Ritz-Carlton at center, built to outdo the Bellevue Stratford across the street. That project, of course, was the cause of the voyage on the Titanic. There were clubhouses, too, most of which Abel couldn't visit. The Union League Annex on the left on 15th Street, which is bigger than the original building, the YMCA on Arch Street, and the Racquet Club on 16th. And then there was university work. Trumbauer's biggest educational patron was tobacco man James Buchanan Duke, for whom Abel designed a very formal mansion on Fifth Avenue, and then oversaw the creation of the 2 campuses in 2 styles needed to transform Durham's Trinity College into Duke University. The men's campus was English Gothic, drawing on Philadelphia's collegiate Gothic expertise, well represented on Trumbauer and Abel's staff. The women were given something more modern and more American, Jeffersonian classicism, which the Trumbauer firm grafted onto the existing campus of Trinity College. Although Duke died just as things were getting started in 1925, the 2 huge projects were built fast, and this kept the office alive during the first years of the Depression. Correspondence shows that Duke administrators knew of Abel's leadership role in the design, and although I think it is still unclear if he ever visited the campus, after Trumbauer's death in 1938, he continued the work of the firm under the banner Office of Horace Trumbauer. Now, however, his own name and that of fellow old-timer William Frank were also visible, as on the drawings for what is now called the Cameron Indoor Stadium. In the last year of his life, 1950, Abel got to see the launch of the last piece of the Gothic West Campus, the Allen Building. His portrait now hangs in that building. To end, we come back to Philadelphia and Philadelphia's universities. Just before the Depression hit, the Trumbauer office designed 2 vertical campuses, skyscraper medical schools for Hahnemann, another architect actually eventually got the job, and Jefferson. Hahnemann was rendered in Art Deco Gothic, while Jefferson was Art Deco Romanesque. And finally, Penn. The auditorium given by William Irvine in 1926 was clearly inspired, at least on the outside, by a dream of Mont Saint-Michel. It's another example of the pluralistic polish characteristic of the Trumbauer firm, which makes it so very difficult to say what did the designers, what did Julian Abel actually like, and what did he design himself? Abel was so consistent in preserving the anonymity of big office practice, and so graceful in navigating around the vile indignities of Jim Crow America, guided, it seems, by a kind of green book for architects, that it is very difficult for us today to reconstruct his likings and his authorship. But we learn more about him every day. Based on the designs with which Abel is known to have been closely connected, I've long suspected that he created the cool classicism, mostly French, but with a hint of Robert Adam, of this house for Otto Eisenlohr, who was another tobacco man. The house was given to Penn by his widow, and it is now the Penn President's House. That's Amy Gutman there with some students at the top left. And we have actually claimed that it was Abel's work for about 30 years. But this, I have to say, was without evidence. That's now changed. A couple of weeks ago, Bill Whitaker, the director of Penn's Architectural Archives, cataloged this blueprint of interior details of the Eisenlohr House, a blueprint which is dated April 1911. And unlike most of the drawings that I've seen from the Trumbauer office, this one has a block at lower right circled in red in which architects and draftsmen logged in the hours that they put in working on the drawing. And it shows that between February and May 1911, 3 men worked on the drawing. And the first was JFA, Julian Francis Abel, who did by far the most, as well as the first work, 11 hours on 3 consecutive days in February. It's of course nice to have one's hunch confirmed, but we still have a lot more to learn about this remarkable person.
I learned a number of years ago that my great-grand-uncle, Louis Magaziner, was the best friend of notable Black architect Julian Francis Abel. Today, I will be exploring what research has taught me about this unusual friendship. Thanks to David, you now have a professional biography of Julian Abel. I will briefly summarize the life of his friend, Louis Magaziner. Louis Magaziner was born in Jmena, Austria, now part of Slovakia. At age 10, he immigrated to Philadelphia along with his parents and 7 siblings to join 3 of his sisters who had come over earlier. Louis is circled in red, my great-grandmother Lena in yellow. After graduating from the University of Pennsylvania with a degree in architecture in 1900, the first Jew to do so, Louis worked for and founded a variety of firms. He worked in a range of styles in many Philadelphia neighborhoods, from the Art Deco Uptown Theater to the modernist Sidney Hillman Medical Center, to the functional Amalgamated Clothing Workers Building, the now demolished Mount Sinai Hospital, as well as many other projects, both in Philadelphia and other locales. Both Julian Abel and Louis Magaziner separately had notable careers, particularly given that they were members of marginalized groups. Abel, a Black man, and Magaziner, an immigrant and a Jew. You can understand why I wanted to learn more about their connection to each other. As any honest 21st century researcher will tell you, I first turned to Wikipedia. From the entry for Julian Abel. He was the first Black student admitted to the Department of Architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. On projects assigned to pairs of students, he was partnered with Louis Magaziner, the only Jewish student in the department who also faced discrimination. This was the beginning of a lifelong friendship between the two. Was I ever excited? As a product of 13 years of Quaker schooling, a veteran of 8 years teaching African American history, and a Jew to boot, this story of oppressed minorities bound together in defiance of established elites really got my self-righteous juices flowing. As I pursued the story, however, the narrative kept shifting, and my understanding of their friendship became more complicated. Today, I will be sharing with you the turning points of my research and my ultimate conclusions about the Abel-Magaziner bond. One of the first sources I consulted was an unpublished manuscript I found at the Athenaeum of Philadelphia, written by Louis's son, Henry Magaziner. Henry followed in his father's footsteps by going to Penn to study architecture. He joined his father's practice and later became a well-known architectural historian and the architect for Independence National Park. Henry was very fond of Julian Abel and hoped to write a historical novel for young adults based on Abel's life. A passage from the never-published would-be book. Quote, "During Lou's last 2 years and Julian's first 2 at Penn, the Jew and the African American joined forces. Both did beautiful work. They became buddies, ate lunch together, attended the football games together, and developed a friendship that would last the rest of their lives." Another passage from Henry's manuscript, describing a scene from a few decades later. Quote, "One Saturday, Julian and his friend Lou were having their usual weekly lunch together. Lou said, 'The other day I was in your Union League edition. It's really very handsome.' Julian replied, 'Thanks, but you won't believe it. I couldn't even go in through the front door. Because I'm black, I had to use the servants' entrance.' 'Well, I'm white,' said Lou, 'so I did go in through the front door. However, I'm Jewish, so I can't join the club. But making you use the servants' entrance, and you were the architect, that's unforgivable.' Naturally, I ate up this fictional conversation, longing for it to be true. Indeed, thanks to Henry, my civil rights narrative remained intact. But here's the thing about Henry. Much to his cousin, my grandfather's, dismay, Henry was a very liberal Democrat, married to a teacher at a Quaker school. Henry was just as susceptible as I am to long for the oppressed outsider narrative. My next research trip was to the architectural archives at the University of Pennsylvania. During the time Abel and Magaziner were students, the School of Architecture followed the École des Beaux-Arts system of instruction. In a 1926 description of the program, written by a professor at Penn School of Architecture, I found the following shocking paragraph. In an atelier, one of the causes for the rapid development of the new student is the tradition already mentioned as one of the features of the école system. The older, more advanced pupils helping the younger, and what goes with it, the younger men working for the older. This latter is called niggering and consists of doing anything the advanced man asks. We know that Abel and Magaziner were indeed formally linked in this way, and most likely the pairing was based on their outsider status. But as I spent time looking through old yearbooks, my oppression narrative was challenged. Louis Magaziner was given the honor of designing and even signing the yearbook cover for Penn's class of 1900. Abel, as David explained, was a winner, a leader, the star student of the class of 1902. Here are Abel and Magaziner as members of the Architectural Society in 1900. As a senior, Abel was elected by his classmates to be the president of the Architectural Society. This image, with Abel sitting almost king-like among his peers, pretty much sums it up. I needed to dig deeper. There had to be more to their bond than a shared rejection by their peers. Another Athenaeum resource, a binder of transcribed interviews done in the late 1980s. The interviewer spoke to Abel's descendants and others who had direct memories of Abel. A consistent picture of Abel emerged. He was described as cultured, quiet, fastidious, and dapper. His hobbies included needlepoint, woodworking, painting, and playing the piano. He attended operas and symphonies. He wore a suit even when vacationing in Wildwood. The closest he came to using profanity were the words confounded and darn. Try to envision his home on a block nicknamed Doctor's Row, as described by his great-nephew, John Cook. Quote, "The living room was 18th century French. He would do his own needlework for the sofa. The dining room was very elegant. He had one Fragonard painting that was huge, and here's an image of a Fragonard painting I found online. And on the other side, he had another Fragonard painting. He had the dining room table in the center of the room. Everything was right, even the fancy sterling silver. We had to dress for dinner." In reading these interviews, it was also clear that Abel was far from a racial firebrand. His wife, Marguerite, was white. His servants were Black. To quote Drek Wilson, Abel's biographer, "For all intents and purposes, Julian did not consider himself Black. He was almost aracial. He buried himself in being an artist." So a new potential narrative emerged. My mom's most vivid memories of her Uncle Lou are that he always took out his drawing materials when she would visit his West Philadelphia home, and that after a leak ruined a patch of ornate wallpaper, Uncle Lou painted in the damaged area with his own hand. My new theory: Lou and Julian were both refined, artistic souls. As such, they must have respected each other's sophistication and taste. As Abel de-emphasized his Blackness and spent most of his free time perfecting his home and engaging in artistic pursuits, I surmised that Magaziner, similarly, was too ethereal to be deeply engaged in the Jewish community. I found some evidence to support my new theory during a visit to the University of Pennsylvania archives. A note to Lou from Warren Laird, then the dean of the architecture school, indicating that he had enclosed a letter of introduction for Abel and Magaziner to use during their upcoming trip to Europe, and a thank you letter from Abel in which he indicated that the trip might have to be postponed. Although the trip never took place, it made sense to me that these two sensitive lovers of high art would want to tour the continent together. I also found the 1900 School of Architecture yearbook and Magaziner's interesting senior projects: an Episcopal church and a baptismal font. Aha, I thought, the smoking guns. Magaziner, like Abel, did not identify with his own people. My next trip to the Athenaeum, however, very quickly contradicted my theory. Magaziner was a meticulous record keeper. Going through his files, it was clear that not only were many of his clients Jewish, but so were his contractors. Magaziner was the architect for the Hillel at Penn State, a Hebrew orphan home, the Jewish Farm School, now Delaware Valley University, and several other Jewish projects, including a number of synagogues. After reading the series of Abel interviews, Julian had become vivid to me. Although Magaziner was my relative, he was still an abstraction several months into my research. I noticed that his obituary mentioned a few organizations with which he was affiliated. My next research stop was the Jewish Archives at Temple University. It was there that I got to hear Lou's voice as I explored his central role in a variety of Jewish organizations. Magaziner was a longtime member of the Pow Wow Club, a literary club launched in the 1890s by members of Philadelphia's Jewish elite. Lou spent decades as the secretary of the organization. He arranged all the meeting times, informed club members about scheduling and rescheduling, and then rescheduling again of their get-togethers. To give you a bit of the flavor of the Pow Wow Club, an invitation to a gathering showing Lou's humor and artistic skills. So it says Chief Irvin Stone, a play on the words Irving Stone, the president of the club at the time, calls for a powwow of all of his delight makers, medicine men, warriors, sachems, and vice versas, etc. And others invited a chorus of bob-haired squaws, LM secretary. And I know it's not very politically correct, but let's keep in mind that this was 1924. And if you look under that first W, you can see that it was definitely Lou's work, the little watercolor as well. And here, a 1946 letter to Lou from then President Jack Solis Cohen. Dear Louis, A number of the members of the powwow were having dinner together the other night and suggested, now that the war is over, we ought to have another meeting. Dr. Rosenbach was with us, and we suggested to him to take it and have the boys at Delancey Street. I think if you will call him, it can be arranged. If he doesn't want to take it, perhaps Leon Obermeyer will, or I will be glad to do it. May I suggest that as a speaker we invite Elkin Henley, Jr. to tell us of his experiences at the various conferences he attended with Roosevelt? In addition, it might also be possible to get Bobby Wolf, who has just returned to Philadelphia after participating in the Nuremberg trials. Very sincerely, Jack Solis Cohen. This letter exemplifies the esprit of the club. The boys at this point were men in their 60s and 70s. Secondly, you can tell by the high-level positions they had during and after World War II from which strata of society these men came. To my surprise, Uncle Lou was also a Mason. He was a member and treasurer of the Hackenberg Lodge. In contrast to the esteemed members of the powwow, the Hackenberg Masons were from a less elevated segment of Jewish society. An automotive parts distributor, a tire salesman, a purveyor of smoked fish, a hardware merchant, a scrap metal trader, a waste material dealer, a patrolman. These were Lou Magaziner's cohorts in the lodge. And if you notice that a physician is included in this particular new member list, I chose it because Dr. Milton Kahn was the dermatologist who got me through those awkward teenage years. But the organization in which Magaziner seems to have been the most active was the board of directors of the Hebrew Sheltering Home and Day Nursery, a social service organization that served the needs of Jewish orphans and unwed mothers. Lou's involvement began in the early 1920s when he was the architect for the building. He became chairman of the House and Grounds and Welfare Committees. Magaziner attended weekly Sunday meetings throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and into the early 1940s. The other leaders included members of his, and thus my, family. So clearly, when Julian Abel was home playing piano and doing needlework surrounded by images of 18th century French aristocrats, Lou Magaziner was engaging in witty repartee with the elite Jewish boys, cementing his Americanness with the striving Jewish Masons, or getting into the weeds of leading a large social service organization with members of his own extended family. And yet, they continued to meet for their Saturday lunches. During football season, they would go to games at Franklin Field, almost certainly the only interracial pair of friends. Out of football season, their post-lunch routine was to visit one or the other's offices to offer critiques and encouragements, both finding that the input of their friend made their own work stronger. And it was to Lou whom Julian turned when his wife Marguerite left him for one of her singing students. Clearly, they were not the civil rights activist I first pictured, nor were they both the sensitive, artistic souls more dedicated to aesthetics than to the welfare of their own people. So here is what I think they shared. First of all, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, they got to know each other during a time of youthful excitement and idealism. In spite of the many slights and barriers that made Abel's life at Penn different than that of his white counterparts, he continued to speak fondly of Penn for the rest of his life. Magaziner, too, undoubtedly felt a few social stings during his time at Penn, yet, like Abel, he clearly did well at and retained affection for his alma mater. Secondly, they were both excellent architects. Abel designed more high-prestige buildings, and Magaziner was able to demonstrate his skills in a wider variety of styles, but they both remained enamored of and respected within their chosen profession. Third, they both displayed a particular type of pride. Both Abel and Magaziner were well-established architects who succeeded very soon after graduating from Penn. But neither of them applied to the American Institute of Architects until they were nearing the end of their careers. Neither Julian nor Lou wanted to openly challenge nor risk rejection from this, at the time, notoriously racist and anti-Semitic organization. They both applied and were admitted in the 1940s, long after their respective bodies of work should have ensured their acceptance. And finally, yes, I guess the final key must have been football. Apparently, they never missed a home game. Go Quakers. And if I've piqued your interest a bit about Lou Magaziner and Julian Abel, if you take a look at hiddencityphila.org and just search either their names, you can find some articles that I wrote that take some of the topics I've covered today and deal with them in greater detail. Thank you.
Amy, thank you so much for that personal history and family archaeology, digging deep into the archives to find the truth, one layer after another, even when it challenges our own assumptions. And David, thank you too for an incredibly important social and historical context for what it was like to live in the city of Philadelphia at the time and what it was like to practice architecture here and all the multiple challenges that people faced. And now, on to our panel discussion. Well, thanks for joining me again. And I have so many questions, I hardly know where to start. I want to ask David to ask Amy questions, Amy to ask David questions. And I suppose
Can we ask you a question?
Yes, you may ask me a question. One of the things that for so many of us, I think, especially given the experiences of the last year and a half, is how do we really hold on to, in a legitimate, genuine way, to advances in diversity and inclusion, especially in professions like architecture, which have not historically really embraced minorities or women. And it's a subject that comes up over and over. And while it's not particular and it's not unique to the story of Julian Abel, for example, or Louis Magaziner, it certainly touches a lot of those points that we've been asked to think about and need to think about over the course of the last couple of years. What's your perspective on that and how life can evolve from here and the profession can evolve from here and chances for people for artistic expression that's real and genuine in the future?
Well, I guess I would say in terms of architecture, it's a pretty steep hill to climb in the sense that architecture is one of those professions where there's a whole lot of education. And then other than kind of the starchitects, it's not a super lucrative field. So it's, if someone is the first family member in their family to go to college, for example, the payoff of studying architecture and becoming an architect is not always appealing. One step that the Stuart Weitzman School at the University of Pennsylvania has taken is they've started a fellowship in Julian Abel's name that is meant for African Americans to study architecture at Penn. So that's certainly a step in the right direction, but it's not going to be easy.
Right, and that's scholarship as well as mentorship?
I believe it's scholarship.
Well, yes, the scholarship itself is a monetary award, but I think that there's certainly an enormous commitment across American higher education today, including at Penn, to foster the development of a university community that looks like America, that is, that our leadership should look like our totality.
Yeah, and our history in the realm of architecture, in any case, has been squarely the other direction.
But I would say that I think that architecture, I do think that there are things about architecture that Amy's talk highlighted that suggest that there are opportunities in architecture that maybe are particularly potent in combating the racism of our society's history. And that is, it is a community defined by talent. That this really is a place where quite literally excellence is visible. And I do think both the Magaziner and the Able story are stories of talent. And as Amy says, and as I think my own work shows, these are not people who were neglected and unsuccessful in their own times. There is within the arts a meritocracy that isn't defined purely by what your name is and where you were born. Another thing I think to keep in mind is that architectural education, university education in architecture, is itself quite new. The Penn Architecture program was only a dozen years old when Able and Magaziner joined it. And in a sense, university education in architecture was a liberating thing. You no longer necessarily had to know somebody and be apprenticed by somebody. You could actually get it, and if you went to one of the great state universities, get it pretty much for free. And so, in other words, the architecture is one of those places where I do think social advancement is possible. Does that mean it occurs? No, but it means it's possible, which is, I think, that the greater challenge to us is to activate that opportunity.
There's the opportunity to transcend based on creative ability and sheer drive, which clearly Magaziner and Able both displayed over and over, and for many years, from the time they were students throughout their entire lives and in many different arenas. I found myself wondering if Julian Able, for example, had made that trip to Paris when he initially wanted to and stayed in France and practiced in France, what would that have looked like in the future?
I think we have some tiny evidence of what that's like, because it is the case that Americans went to Paris and stayed there, and that we have, and they did that from the colonial period onward because of France's cachet. To some extent, one can see it sometimes comes back and enriches American culture. I think it can see that particularly in some of the painters who went to Paris and stayed there. A famous example, an African American example, is Henry Ozawa Tanner, the painter. But I think, quite candidly, those who leave America don't end up having much impact in America. And I think that if Julian Able had gone to France and stayed in France, I don't think we'd be talking about Julian Able.
Uh-huh. It's interesting. Amy, I was so interested to hear your multi-layered and multi-level series of revelations about what the truth is, and the truth as you dig deeper and explore more. And I have to say that my firm's been involved with the restoration of 6 Trumbauer buildings, 4 of which were done after Able joined the firm. And I'm sorry to say that 15 years ago, I didn't know who Able was. I just described everything to Trumbauer. And I think we do that in so many different areas of life, but particularly in architecture. The person whose name is on the door is the one who is the creative genius. And yes, perhaps there's someone drafting in the back. But that last slide that you showed, David, of the timesheet actually being recorded on the detail drawings, I thought was fascinating. There you have, in blue and white, a record of whose hand was really in that. And there were probably a dozen more. And so the idea of collaboration and collective effort and shared responsibility and shared fame should be promoted.
Yeah, and I found when I was doing research, there were a number of more recent pieces about Able that really implied that Trumbauer didn't want to give him credit. There was implication that he particularly didn't want to give him credit because he was a Black man. And yet that was how the firm worked. Trumbauer's name went on everything. And some evidence that Able was okay with that is that when he applied to the American Institute for Architects, the only buildings he listed were his sister's home out west that he had done right after graduating, and then the Duke University campus, because that was clearly an Able project. And
And only the buildings built after Trumbauer died.
yeah, other than his sister's home, they were all post Trumbauer because he'd been working under Trumbauer. Right. So,
and was that also possibly because the plutocrats, who were a major chunk of that clientele, wanted an association particularly with Trumbauer and with no one else?
I think that there was a level of comfort with Trumbauer. I mean, to be candid about it, Trumbauer was not a blazing star in the architectural firmament. He was a reliable architect who did good work in whatever style you wanted and had a team of people who could execute it. And I think it was that that attracted his client base to him. He had a great team working for him. And I think, I just wanted to go back to what you'd said about the signature block with the different names in it. There are two other names in that. Julian Able we know about, and he did a lot of it. CR is Charles Rabinold. I bet not many people have ever heard of him, but he was probably the second most important designer in the office at that time. And the guy in the middle is just initials. We have no idea who that was. And I do think that that's actually another aspect of architectural practice that to some extent is liberating, and that it is a project. Most of these projects are projects of collaboration in which there's places for lots of people. And there's a wonderful photograph of the office of Cope and Stewardson from around 1900, which was one of the other big architectural practices. And it's a room full of about 20 people. And there's a woman standing there. And we know her name, but we have no idea who she is. I mean, she's, again, one of these enigmatic figures that we see standing in these crowd photographs. And I think it's important to think of architecture as a project, as you're saying, as a product of these collaborations, of people who, the best we can do is put together little pieces of the narrative. And I think that, in the case of Trumbauer, it should be noted that there's a particular difficulty, is that there are no surviving office records from his firm. And so we don't know for sure. We actually do not know for sure when Julian Able took over as chief designer. We just assume that he did at a particular time because the previous chief designer left, but there may have been an interim. I mean, we just do not know. And much of the work that we do in piecing this together has to be looking at what the client's records are. And unfortunately, the Philadelphia Museum of Art has literally no records of its construction in its archives. And the Free Library has blessed few. I mean, so it's really excruciatingly difficult to put some of these things together. The Harvard archives have yielded up correspondence between high-ranking Harvard people and Able. And so those people clearly knew they were working with Able. And I'm sure that the Wideners and the Elkins knew that they were working with Able. I mean, that they would have known that. And the architects and artists on the art jury who reviewed the designs for the Art Museum and the Free Library would have known that Able was doing that. And probably they would also know that he wasn't doing other things. And that's, in some respects, that's this other side of this. We still don't know who designed the other buildings in Trumbauer's practice.
All of which underscores how important what you're both doing is in trying to peel away those layers and get at the truth that lies deeper and deeper and deeper about who was building what and why, and who was organizing the creative process, and who was in charge of really getting the buildings built. I mean, it's very interesting that you say that the Philadelphia Museum of Art has virtually no records, and it's true, because when they started the core project, which is a multi-decade sort of big-ish number project, and they started digging into the ground, assuming that the scant records and drawings that were there were reliable. Well, no, of course they weren't, and there was surprise after surprise after surprise. This looks to us, in modern eyes, as not paying attention, not being competent, but in fact it was just the practice of the day. You get out there and you build. Yeah. And wonderfully, they had incredible talent, and they must have had incredible engineers at the same time, but documentation was less so. And it fascinates me that there's a woman standing in Cope and Stewartson's office ready to go, obviously a member of the team, and yet none of us, even those of us who've been working on Cope and Stewardson buildings for the last couple of years, don't know.
Well, I mean, I would say you could walk into an architecture office in Philadelphia today and ask everyone to stand up and take a photograph, and they'd be in exactly the same position. You don't know who is doing what. And frankly, if you search the records, you probably couldn't figure it out either based on the records. Who was the principal designer of that building? Who devised that feature of it? Who was the reliable person who made sure the project came in on budget, but really didn't design?
Right. And so that makes it harder then to explain the whole process and profession to younger kids who are thinking about architecture, even if they even know architecture as a field. And how do you get them to a level of comfort and access that they start to believe that they too have a position in this profession? And it's one of the reasons the ICAA started the New Heights program, which focuses on 8th graders, key moment in the development of their aesthetics and their curiosity, but also at an age where they're old enough to start to process that information and apply it to themselves. So this has been a huge step forward, but I'm curious for both of you, and particularly for you, Amy, since you've had so much experience with educating kids of that age, where is that spark of creativity? How do they capture that and believe that they can make that their own and that they have something to contribute to the world in this sphere?
Well, I think often that spark comes through the arts, interestingly. I taught at a very academic middle and high school, so I had a lot of experience with the kind of kids who just would grind away and do the best they could and get the right answer and so forth. But even within that context, the kids who weren't the sort of obvious scholars, it was often through the arts that they would get a spark, develop some confidence, and see their unique creativity as having something to offer the world.
It's wonderful. One of the other things that strikes me as unique about architecture is that it's mandatory collaboration. There is no such thing as someone who sits down, surveys the land, draws the plans, digs the hole, frames the build. It doesn't happen. So by its nature, you have to start working with people who are experienced knowledge base that you don't have, techniques and understanding of materials and tectonics and everything that goes into the making of a building and the built environment. And it literally is a city that's building a city. And I think that's one of the things that architecture teaches as well as anything else, and that is the inherent necessity of collaboration and working together and seeing creation as a bigger picture and not just something that comes out of an individual's head. And I think that's one of the big learnings for me about what we've discussed with and discovered with Able is that it's not just Trumbauer does it again. No. There's a whole lot more to it than that. And mastery of many skills is important, but also learning how to work with other people and to find those people and promote those people.
I do think that in the broadest possible terms, that may be the great lesson for us today as we think about our society. The greatest projects are those created by collaboration, crystallized around brilliant ideas. In a sense, an architecture is a place where both are required. You need invention and brilliance, and you need collaboration. And my gosh, there's so many things that we do that would benefit from that combination.
And I also think Magaziner and Able, something that really was beautiful about their friendship was even though they worked on vastly different projects, they did continue to critique each other's work throughout their careers, and both were the better for it.
Adult friendship is a rare and precious thing, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And an adult friendship and adult professional friendship where respect and the interplay of ideas is paramount. It's something that I know a lot of practitioners in design and architecture in many different fields is more in the loss of, mainly because we don't take the time for it anymore to invent the opportunities to learn from each other if we're not in a large firm, but is absolutely, as we can see, pivotal in continuing to learn and opening your eyes to new techniques, new styles, new approaches, because both of them were working in radically different styles with different budgets, with different expectations throughout their careers. And I think it's what kept them both individually fresh and vibrant, and definitely as a friendship that was supportive of the development of each of them. I'm recalling something that Peter Cook, who is Julian Abel's great-grand-nephew, I always have to pause to get that exactly right, said about how daunting it was. He, an architect at design principal at HGA today in Washington, D.C., said about the first time he drove onto Duke's campus, and they drove up to the chapel, and they were driving through this dense green forest, and he said, and there's the building, woo, right in front of your face, and you get these layers of response, emotional response from it, and you start to understand the power of architecture, and not just the power of a building to move you, but the power of personal impact on it, what it means to have an ancestor of yours part of that development, but also to understand how important it is to the environment and how many people's lives were affected just by that same moment of discovery of beauty in the built environment. So I think it's a lasting legacy that we all get to enjoy.
Well, I think that architecture, I mean, and I'm speaking, of course, from a position of a deeply prejudiced position with respect to my views about architecture. I do think that architecture has a potency and an importance in human life that is unmatched by almost anything else, because it is, architecture is literally where human life lives. And when you talk about an environment shaping human experience, of course, architecture literally shapes it, physically shapes it, but it also operates on all of those other dimensions as well. It tells stories about our own past, perhaps our family's relationship to a particular place, but it also tells broader human stories about aspiration, and it contains within it, I think, one of the most extraordinary capacities that modern people possess. Architecture really is an agent of change. Architecture is something that, as you make it, depending on how you make it, you can make a better society through the shape of the architecture that you devise. And I think that is another intensely important thing for us to keep in mind in this particular era.
And David, you might have more to say to this, because I know you're very involved in the Preservation Alliance of Greater Philadelphia, but right now we are really in danger of losing a lot of our architectural heritage. Like you can't be in Philadelphia and not know the main branch of the Free Library and the Art Museum, and those Able projects are just kind of, everyone knows them, but Louis Magaziner's projects, many have been knocked down. Yes. We have a street in Philadelphia called Jewelers Row, and a number of the historic buildings on that street were knocked down to make room for a high-rise. Louis Magaziner has a building on that street a few blocks to the west. Right. And, I agree that architecture is about where we live. Our built environment is so important, and I'm just afraid that, at least in Philadelphia, we're really in danger of losing some of that heritage.
Well, I do think there's a particular Philadelphia crisis. I mean, the truth is, the simple factual truth is that Philadelphia affords legal protection to a smaller percentage of our historic buildings than any other major city. We have the least well-funded historical commission of any American city, and my view, and I'll say it very briefly, is it is a squandering of a resource.
Irreplaceable.
And if we were fortunate enough to live on top of a uranium mine, you can be sure, I would imagine that we would have made excellent surveys of the uranium and have plans for making the most of it. Well, I think of history as our atomic power.
Yeah, and both David and I in our talks talked about Doctors Row, the block where Julian Abel lived, and there have been homes, again, just a few doors down from Julian Abel's home.
The house right next to his house, the one just east of it, is no longer there. We both showed photographs of a building that's no longer there. And it is, in fact, that demolition that has led to, I think, a very important, maybe even a game-changing move by the city of Philadelphia to declare a temporary moratorium on demolitions on that street while the full legal protection for it that is afforded by a historic district is created.
Well, and this is just brings up the fact that those neighborhoods that so shaped us and our society and our history are neighborhoods. It's not an iconic building. It's not the art museum. It's not the free library. It's how all this got knitted together. And Philadelphia's had a long and complicated architectural history, and the neighborhoods have changed many, many times. And of course, the city, during the City Beautiful movement, which you know more than anyone else about, with this grand boulevard going through all the working class neighborhoods, could have been done in a way that the city kind of unraveled. But it didn't. It created a new fiber, by and large. But it means that all of us have to start thinking about the built environment not as building A plus building B plus building C. It's fabric, and it's fabric that creates a safety net in a defining area for all of us, its citizens, and it makes a neighborhood a neighborhood. And if we lose neighborhoods, that's even more devastating than losing singular buildings.
Well, and I do think it's a challenge. The buildings that we've been talking about today were all built into the 20th century. They were, until quite recently, considered not sufficiently old to be historically interesting. And we have an enormous, and the work of Louis Magaziner is really almost all of it just becoming old enough to be considered worthy of protection. And some notable ones that were protected have been torn down anyway. I think that is all for us a challenge to expand what we understand to be history, to expand it in terms of the types of buildings we consider. We should consider modest buildings. The working class houses of Philadelphia is immensely diverse, multiracial, multi-ethnic communities. All of that deserves to be understood and interpreted and protected, as you say, as fabric. And I do think that historic preservation has a boulder to move, because it is possible to look at historic preservation and to see that it's basically only about preserving monuments and important civic buildings and buildings associated with the establishment, when in fact, and I think that's a bad rap, but it's understandable why people should feel it, historic preservation from its roots, almost from its founding, has been about preserving the ordinary and the broader historical story. And I think we have to be true to that, particularly at this time, that we are not. Jewelers Row and Doctors Row need not be preserved in order to promote gentrification. They need to be preserved in order to promote social stability and cultural values.
There's an important distinction. If you were to be graduating from architecture school today, you're Louis Magaziner and you're Julian Abel, where would you see yourself going? What buildings would you be working on? What would fascinate you now?
I guess what I can say for what I know of Louis Magaziner's career, what I understand of it, was that he really liked working in a variety of styles. So much so that you can't walk down the street and say, oh, that looks like a Magaziner, in the way you can say, oh, that looks like an I.M. Pei, Louis Kahn. I mean, he didn't have a signature style, but something that his grandson, Fred, shared with me was that his buildings all worked. I mean, there's some buildings by famous architects that are notorious for leaking or notorious for, looking spectacular when they are first erected and then not aging well because there wasn't enough thought put to, the exterior materials. And I just really liked that he obviously took pride in competence and serving his clients. So I think today he'd probably still be doing the same thing.
And David, put on your Julian Abel hat and see what happens.
Well, I mean, to be true to Julian Abel, I think it's safe to say that if he graduated from architecture school today, he would be looking to work in a big firm that was doing interesting international projects and important civic buildings, and that for famous clients. And I think it would be a disservice to his own values to say that he'd be something different from that. I think I think that is there is a lot of good work that's done in that context. I think that and the truth of the matter is that the architectural establishment today is still very much like the architectural establishment that he worked in. There are lots of opportunities to do that kind of work, and there's probably a slightly greater chance that you might, as an individual designer working in a large firm, be recognized for your work, but only slightly. And I take it at face value what those who interviewed him, and more importantly those who interviewed those who knew him, because it's gotten to be sort of extended, that he was in fact a very modest man, that he really didn't, that this is the way he wanted it.
I was thinking the exact same thing, David. I mean, I did read all those interviews that I mentioned in my talk, but then also I've spoken to his son. Julian Abel Jr. is at this point probably 94, lives in California, and we've talked on the phone, and he's told me his father was really quite a modest person, and there's no sense that Abel was this frustrated guy thinking, oh, why is Trumbauer getting all the glory? I think, similar to Magaziner, he was a bit of an architecture nerd. He liked the details and he liked doing good work, and he wasn't really in it for the glory.
Right. Or promoting the way many of the famous key name architects at the time had to be salesmen at least as much as they were designers. Otherwise, the competition would have swallowed you.
And it's I think it's important to say that both of these men succeeded in material and social terms. They did not struggle. I think that is important to say, and certainly it's one element of Amy's wonderful explication. One should not romanticize them as being what they were not. They were successful in their own terms. I have the distinct feeling that both of them were sound sleepers. That they and that Trumbauer was too. That they were all doing it. And the truth of the matter is that there are reasons to be concerned about that. That sort of sense of self-satisfaction and maybe not pushing the envelope is something that maybe we should pause a moment before accepting completely. But I don't think that we should put it on them that they should have been different.
I agree, although with one caveat, which is during the Great Depression, Louis Magaziner lost everything. And was under a great deal of stress. He actually had a heart attack as a fairly young man, and then recovered and lived many more years. But his son, Henry Magaziner, had to drop out of Penn because they couldn't afford it, and he sold Fells Naphtha soap door to door until he could return. So I don't think he slept well during the Depression, but other than that, I think especially after powwow nights, he slept very well.
And quite seriously, it's also the case that the Trumbauer firm, after they had finished the major core campus projects, did not have a string of commissions that was unbroken through the Depression. And they did have layoffs and closed, and the office dwindled away to very few as well. I think that Abel may have been okay during that, but I'm not sure of that either.
Well, we'll all sleep well tonight because we were very, very happy, and thank you both for sharing this story that I think is unique. It touches so many different aspects of what we think about in the creative process, in the business of architecture, and in the future of architecture, and especially this very poignant story about a special lifelong friendship that operated so beautifully on so many different levels and helped each of them develop as human beings and develop as stellar architects and happy men. Yeah. So thank you, David. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
It was wonderful being with you.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
On behalf of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art, thank you for being part of this special presentation tonight. If you're a member, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts. If you're not a member, please think about joining us in the future, because we don't want you to miss any of the special programming that we have in store for you all year round.